Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. In today's video, we take a look back at all of the Fusion champions of 2023. Now, there were 13 Fusion champions introduced into the game this year, and I'm going to give you my personal tier list of all 13. Now, there are a lot of champions to cover, so let's get started. A quick note before we get going, we are still in the midst of our subscriber push. We're trying to get 4,000 subscribers by the end of this year. So we have 3 days left and about 250 subscribers to go. If you can help us out, please hit the like button for this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and consider joining our Discord community. Whether we hit our goal or not, it has been an incredible year, so thank you for all of the support. Okay, so here are the 13 fusions from this year. Starting in January, we got Pythion, then Oella, Supreme Elhain, Razzlevarg, Jetney the Giant, Great Hoof Loriaka, Newt, Emic Trunkheart, Strategos Islan, Bamboos Fourleaf, I think, Timid the Fool, Ugir, the Worm Slayer, or something like that, and Blizzard the Howler. So 13 fusions. We always get a bonus one. We get one for every month plus a bonus one, usually the Christmas one. So these were actually all kind of individual month fusions, I think until around Islan, where we started to overlap between 2 months per fusion. And we ended up with 13. Now, I don't own all of these champions. I went for most of the fusions this year. I actually did fail the Razzlevarg fusion. I skipped Jetney and Loriaka, and I also skipped Bamboos. But I have all of the other champions. Now, I'm going to give you my assessment of all 13 champions, but I'm going to try to keep my assessment focused around 3 criteria. The first is I am a free-to-play player, so I'm always looking at champions from a free-to-play perspective. The second thing is if any of these particular fusions was the first fusion for a player, how good would that fusion have been in terms of improving progression in the game or adding to the roster? And then finally, I want to look at the champions as endgame champions. What roles do they play at the endgame, and how well do they play those roles? Now, I fully expect that many of you may disagree with my assessment of these champions. Please feel free to put in the comments below any use cases that you envision for these champions or any uses you have for these champions that I have overlooked. Definitely let me know if you agree or disagree with my individual ranking. Just a reminder, while this is supposed to be an informative video, all of our judgments about champions are relative to our own roster, our own place in the game, and our personal play style. So just keep that in mind when you are formulating your comments about any of these champions. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through the champions based on the chronological order of their release. So we're going to start at the beginning of the year with Pythion. Now, I completed the Pythion fusion and he instantly made a huge impact on my roster. He's great in a lot of places. He has this really amazing A2, which is a cleanse and a heal and a block debuffs. So this is really a fantastic skill. He does other things. He's a reviver. He has a heal on his A1, but I think the primary use for him is this block debuffs and cleanse. He also has this really nice passive that reduces incoming damage. So there are a lot of great places where you can use Pythion. And I think right away, right out of the get-go, we've got a nice S tier champion. I think this is actually almost the perfect definition of an S tier champion. So you can see I do have a God tier above S tier, and I think that tier is reserved for those champions who are among the best of the best, either the best at what they do or amongst the best champions in the entire game. I think S tier is a champion who is very powerful, incredibly useful, and is always going to help you both in terms of progression and at endgame. And I think Pythion fits the bill perfectly. You can use him in a ton of places. If you get him early, he's going to be a support carry for your team. If you get him late, you're still going to find tons of uses for him. So, classic S tier champion in my estimation. All right, so in February, we got Oella, who was from... Okay, so in February, we got Oella from the Sylvan Watchers factions, and I think originally she was viewed as a mediocre to maybe slightly above average champion. So probably like a high B tier champion by most of the community. I think some people passed on her because of that. I think, in fact, I may have passed on her, but I pulled her from a shard. I'm not even 100% sure if I did the fusion or got her from a shard because I didn't build her for months. But she does actually have a pretty versatile kit. And over time, I think we all discovered exactly how good she is. First of all, if you look at her base stats, she's got great base stats, 110 speed, over 21,000 HP. She provides a lot of heals. She does have a 100% chance of a decreased speed on her A1, which is actually super. That's very reliable. You want that 100% chance. She's got a really nice heal on her A2, which is also a increase buff duration skill. And that's not to be underestimated. That can be very powerful. She also has turn meter fill and increase resist. And then she has these continuous heals that come out on her passive whenever an ally is damaged of more than 50% of their max HP from a single hit. She also has increased ally resistance in dungeons by 75%. So she's really good at increasing your team's resistance and keeping them alive, and then even extending their buffs. I think early on you could use her as a support carry, absolutely. I think later on you're going to find uses for her in Doom Tower, in Hydra, and in some other places as well. She's not really a specialist, although that resistance kind of strengthening of your team is probably her core mechanic. So if you're struggling anywhere getting the resistance that you need, Oella can really help you out. As a result, I think that she's definitely increased in value over time, and she probably slots in as an A tier champion now. Now, in terms of A tier, is she at the top of the A tier? Is she almost S tier? Is she down at the bottom near the B tier? I'm not really sure. I actually feel that based on my usage of her, she slots in right in the middle of A tier. She's a solid A tier champion. I'm happy to have her on my roster. I can find uses for her at endgame. I do think she's going to be a strong progression champion. Probably not as strong as Pythion in terms of progression, but not too far off. So I do feel like she is a classic A tier champion from my perspective as a free-to-play player. Okay, now for our third champion, we are looking at Supreme Elhain. We got all of the starter champions Supreme versions this year, right? We got our Supreme Elhain. She was the fusion. When we were ranking those 4 Supreme champions, I think they're all Supreme champions. Is it Ultimate Gaelic? I forget now. But so all of them are very good champions. I do think that Elhain was considered one of the weaker ones. But what I will say is, after experiencing her in live arena and in arena, she's an incredible arena nuker. She is Void Affinity, which is fantastic. And one of the skills that she has, which is very powerful, is this A3. Attacks one enemy, will ignore ally protection, strengthen, and shield buffs. It grants an extra turn if this attack kills an enemy. And then if you mix that with this passive, where she is immune to decreased attack debuffs, but this second part here, she inflicts 20% more damage against targets whose attack is lower than this champion's attack. So she's a great tank killer. Her A2 is strong. Damage increases by 10% for each debuff on each target. And this resets the cooldown of crack shot skill if this attack kills an enemy. So you can kill an enemy with this A3, get an extra turn, kill an enemy with the A2. That will reset the A3. So on the next turn, you'll be able to kill off any tanks who happen to be tanky enough to stick around. She hits really hard, Void Affinity, no weak hits. Her multipliers are fantastic. Her passive gets her a lot of extra damage. This is one of the harder hitting champions I think that was introduced to the game this year. My personal issue with Supreme Elhain is that I think nukers are not as valuable as good support champions. There are a ton of great nukers in the game. So I struggle with putting her above anything like greater than A tier without something absolutely exceptional. So I do think she's in the A tier. Compared to other arena nukers, she might be like an A+. I don't know that she cracks the top 5 or 8 arena nukers in the game, but she may be sitting just outside of them at something like 10 or 12. It's hard to say. I haven't built mine myself, but I've certainly seen some scary Supreme Elhains in the arena. So I feel comfortable sticking her in the A tier, but if you wanted to push her up a little bit, I probably wouldn't object. Okay, now we come to Razelvarg. He was the 4th fusion this year. Now, I am a little bit sad about Razelvarg. This is the one fusion I attempted and failed this year. And I failed it kind of late, which was disappointing. But you can't win every single time. Now, I do think he's a very good champion. He's excellent in Clan Boss. He can be really good in Hydra. He can do some special things with his passive, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist anywhere else in the game. So for every increased speed buff placed by this champion, he increases his personal speed by 5 up to 100. So after 20 increased speed buffs, he's going to have an additional 100 speed. So he's very good for long fights where speed is a benefit. Now, he does have an AoE leech, but you'll notice one of the things here, which is that his damage is also potentially, partially at least, based on his speed. So his multipliers can get very good. He does have a triple hit on his A1 that fills turn meter, which it makes him even faster. And an aura of ally speed in all battles by 20%. And there on the A3 is the increased speed, also with an increased accuracy. His base speed is 110. You can see he's not particularly tanky. He is kind of squishy, but he hits decently hard. And there are some really cool uses for this champion. I think the best uses are Clan Boss, Hydra, and Fire Knight hard mode. There are some really interesting ways to use him in those 3 places. He's a little bit tricky to set up. He's certainly difficult to speed tune, and you need a team around him to support him. So because of that, what I would say is I think he is probably another A tier champion. If you get him early enough, he's definitely going to be a good carry for you in terms of progression, and he still has some uses at endgame, but I don't think he's the best at anything that he does or anything that you need done, and he doesn't bring much more than that speed and damage. So I think it's fair to say he's an A tier champion. Okay, champion number 5 was Jetney the Giant. Now, originally I skipped on Jetney and I thought she was fairly poor as far as a fusion champion, especially after looking at the first 4 champions of the year. You can see we have 1 S tier and 3 A tier champions, and I don't think she's as good as those champions. But I think because we had a pretty strong run of fusion champions, I actually undervalued her. She's a very good arena nuker. She has an A2 that will ignore 20% of each target's defense. She also has a 100% chance of placing decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. So you can use her for that debuff, or you can just ignore the debuff and bring it with somebody else. She also has an A3, which is an AoE that hits 2 times. And before attacking, she places an increased crit rate and increased crit damage buff on herself for 2 turns. If you have her paired up with Alsgore Crimson Horn, she gets a little bit stronger. This extra turn mechanic is actually incredibly powerful. And finally, she has a nice passive that inflicts 20% more damage against targets under shield buffs, and she completely ignores those buffs if Alsgore is on the team. Now you can see from her base stats that her base speed is fine at 100, her base attack is nice and high, her multipliers are on the low side, but because of the passive extra damage and the ignored defense here on the A2 and the self-buffing, she actually hits pretty hard. Now, again, like I said with Supreme Elhain, I don't value nukers, especially arena nukers, too highly because there are so many of them. And she is an affinity-based champion. She also doesn't hit quite as hard as Dark Elhain. But I don't think she's as bad as I originally thought. And so I'm going to put Jetney into the B tier. I don't think I can put her on par with Dark Elhain, with Supreme Elhain. And so she has to be at least 1 tier down. But I think I originally thought she was probably a C tier champion, and now I feel like she's better than I originally gave her credit for. Okay, now we come to Great Hoof Loriaka. This was another fusion that I skipped, and I actually don't own this champion. Looking at her base stats, she actually looks pretty nice. She's got 18.5k HP, 1100 attack, 1200 defense, 105 speed. She's got 30 base resistance, 20 base accuracy. So overall, nice stats. She does bring some usable skills to the game. She has a decreased resistance. It is a 100% chance AoE, and it does fill her turn meter for each debuff that she lands. There aren't too many decreased resistance champions in the game, so that will give her a place. In addition, she also has a block debuffs buff that she can place on all allies for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown, which is very nice. And this is also a turn meter fill. I think both of these skills are usable, but there aren't a ton of places where you want decreased resistance. In addition, she doesn't hit particularly hard. She's a support champion, Her A1's a little bit underwhelming. It is a 2-hitter that has a 50% chance of stealing a random buff. It's not bad, not great. And then her passive fills her turn meter each time an ally buff is removed, transferred, stolen, or expired. So she will get some extra turns and she's moving relatively fast. The problem with this champion is I can't envision a ton of places where you want to use her. In terms of a decreased resistance, I actually feel like an increased accuracy buff is just better because this requires accuracy to land, whereas an increased accuracy buff does not. And so that's a little bit problematic. Also, it can be blocked. It can be cleansed. So that's a little bit troublesome. I think she's an okay champion. There are probably some people out there who are getting very good use out of Great Floriaka. I think she's a niche champion, and if you need her for that niche, she probably does a very solid job. But without being a great progression champion and without being a great endgame champion, and as a free-to-play player, when I look at this, she doesn't add enough to my roster to really impress me. And as a result, I think we have our first C-tier champion. Now, again, that may be a little bit unfair because in her niche, she may do quite a bit better than what you would consider as a C-tier champion. But again, I'm looking at the overall picture here. And so this just feels like the weakest champion we've seen so far in 2023 as a fusion. At least to this point. Okay, so now let's move into the second half of the year. So here is Newt. I believe he was in August of this year. Newt is an amazing champion. He's a defensive-based damage dealer, high base defense, which is really nice. He's got some accuracy, which he needs. His A1 has a 100% chance of reducing turn meter by 15% on each hit, which is really nice. And if the target's turn meter is not decreased, each hit has a 100% chance of placing a freeze debuff on the target instead. That's incredibly powerful for Fire Knight, both in normal Fire Knight and in Fire Knight hard mode. He's got an AoE that's a decreased attack and weaken, also gives him a counterattack. And then his A3 nuke, which is incredibly hard hitting. So it does do damage based on enemy max HP plus his defense. This is a triple hitter. Each hit decreases the target's defense by 3%, and that stacks up to 30%. So this will happen over the course of the fight. And then it also heals this champion by 30% of the damage dealt, so he has nice sustain. If you have Newt, you know exactly how good he is. He is in some of the absolute best teams in the game, all over the game. He is an absolute boss killer. He's a monster against every single boss. There is no boss really you can't bring him up against. He's great in wave content because of his AoE weaken, and his decreased turn meter on his A1 makes him viable basically against any boss that can have turn meter reduced. The only place I don't use this guy is in Arena, and I bet you could use him there too, but he's definitely designed to be a great PvE champion. If you got him as a free-to-play player through the Fusion event, you're incredibly happy because he has added something to your roster you desperately needed, and that is just boss-killing damage. In terms of versatility, the versatility is very high. In terms of progression, his progression, like if you got him early on your account, he's in every single team you have. And then at endgame, he is in the best teams in the game. This is what a god tier champion looks like. There aren't that many of them, but he has to be one. I can't put him in the S tier. He is definitely stronger than Pythion, and Pythion deserves to be in the S tier, which means we need a tier above S tier, and that's where Newt lives, in the god tier. I don't think I'm going to get any pushback on that. He's arguably one of the best fusions, maybe the best fusion we've ever had in Raid. Okay, so now we come to Emic Trunkheart. Emic Trunkheart's status in the community has been kind of interesting. When he was first announced, I think everybody was very excited for a new unkillable champion, and then his stock kind of declined a little bit as people thought he was going to be too complicated to use particularly well. They did nerf his A1, which I think was a reasonable nerf, but it made people unhappy. And so I think at first people thought he was going to be maybe S tier, and then he dropped down to maybe A tier, maybe even high B tier. And then as the fusion progressed and people got him, he started to climb back up. We found speed tunes for him in Clan Boss. He's an amazing Clan Boss champion. But now what I've discovered recently is the more that I use Emic, the more that I want to use Emic. He's usable everywhere. If you got him early in your account, he would be incredibly powerful in helping you to progress because his kit is really strong in so many ways. First of all, he is a void champion. He's got great stats, 23,000 HP, almost 1,200 defense, 105 base speed. He's also got 50 base resistance, which is really nice. His A1 is fine. It grows shields, but the A2 is really the skill that I think has become so strong and was maybe a little bit overlooked at first. So this is an AoE that places a shield buff on all allies, but it also decreases the cooldown of all ally skills except this champion's by 1 turn. So we introduced a new unkillable champion to the game who also has a decrease cooldown skill. Now there aren't that many champions in the game who decrease the cooldown of all ally skills. I think there are in fact only 6 now. I think Emic Trunkheart was the 6th, maybe the 7th. So being accessible to everybody, being void affinity, being as tanky as he is, and decreasing the cooldown of all ally skills is just incredibly valuable, in addition to the fact that he has a taunt with an unkillable buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 4-turn cooldown. You can use this guy everywhere. He is definitely at the top of the list in terms of clan boss champions, but you can also use him in Iron Twins. You can use him in a seer comp to clear waves really quickly. You can use him almost anywhere in the game. And as the months go by, this guy's stock keeps rising. He's getting better and better and better. And I'm pretty sure in 3 months' time, we're going to think of this guy as one of the top 5 fusions all time. So I actually think that he kind of creeps up into the God tier here. I'm not quite ready to put him up there yet. I think he is definitely above Pythion in terms of this year's fusions, and he maybe sits just below Newt. I think this was the 2nd best fusion of 2023, and he's like demigod status for me. I'm not quite sure that he's God tier. He's S+ tier. Let's call him S+ tier. So we're going to sit him right there between S tier and God tier. Okay, now we come to Strategos Islan. Now, if you watched my fusion preview of this champion, you know that I was very high on this champion when I think the community opinion of him was not quite as optimistic. I think one of the reasons that Islan got a bad rap is because we had just had back-to-back really excellent fusions. We had Newt and then we had Emic, 2 potentially God tier fusions, and then we had Strategos Islan. So a lot of people passed on Islan. I think there was a lot of fatigue in the fusions. You know, the community was ready for a break and they were hoping to have a pass. And they thought, well, we've got back-to-back tanks here. We just had Emic. We don't need Islan. Now, I happen to think that Islan is fantastic. He's got one of the best passives in the game for survivability. Whenever this champion is attacked, heals themselves by 1% for each 500 defense this champion has. Also heals all other allies under ally protection buffs placed by this champion by 30% of this skill's initial heal. So he does have an ally protection and an increased defense. He also has a 100% AoE slow, which is actually highly valuable. He is magic affinity, so it can weak hit. But that skill alone, in conjunction with his passive, makes him incredibly powerful. If you look at his base defense at 1,520 and his HP pool at 19.5k, base speed of 102, resistance of 50, even 10 accuracy, he's got great base stats. I think he's a very good champion. As time has gone by, I haven't used him as much as I thought I would. I think, though, from a progression standpoint, he may be one of the best champions on this list. He just provides something that is hard to get early on in an account. So if you were 4, 5, 6 months in and you went after Islan and got him, my guess is he is a hard carry for your team. At endgame, the best use case for him is probably Hydra and Doom Tower. Those are important places to have good champions for, so I do think he has some value at endgame, but I think he's not as good as Emic, and so I have to compare him to Pythion. Is he as strong as Pythion or not? And the question I have here is endgame. Do I use Islan at endgame as much as I use Pythion? And I think the answer is no. So I have to take a knock on Islan, even though I really like this guy and he's one of my favorite champions from this year. I have to knock him a little bit below Pythion. I do think potentially he provides something that the champions in the A tier don't provide. He gives you something unique. So I think his niche is stronger than the niches of these 3 champions in the A tier. So I'm actually going to put him in between the A tier and the S tier. We'll call him an A+ champion. I think that Island deserves to be a little bit better than Oella, Supreme Elhain, and Razelvarg, but not as good as Pythion. So that's where we're going to land. I don't know. This might be controversial for this pick. People might think he's not that good, but I think he's very good. And I plan to keep trying to find ways to use him. Okay, now we get to another fusion that I skipped with, which is Bamboos. Now, as far as I know, Bamboos is like the nichiest of niche champions. He does have decent base stats, absolutely. Speed of 110, base HP of 21.5k. He has an interesting kit. He has this weird sleep mechanic. He's got the enfeeble debuff. So there are some interesting aspects to his kit. He's complex. He's complicated. I don't think he's that strong in that many places. The people who have found good uses for him maybe really like him for that use or those uses. But like I said, I think he is about as niche as it gets in terms of, at least the fusion champions from this year. So I think he's even more niche than Great Hufloriaka is. I don't think he's a great progression carry. If you got him early, I do think he'd add some value to your count. But I think really you need to have very good resources and a large roster to get the maximum value out of Bamboos. So unfortunately, I think this is our second C tier champion. Again, maybe I'm devaluing niche champions a little bit too much. I don't know. You could definitely call him like an A tier champion if that niche is applicable to your roster. But I skipped him because I didn't think I was going to have a way to really get maximum value out of him. And I don't feel like I'm upset about skipping him, right? Like I feel entirely fine about skipping him. I'm upset about missing out on Razelvarg. I'm not upset about missing out on Bamboos. That may change in the future. I don't know. It may turn out that he is better than I think he is. But for right now, I'm pretty comfortable. Like I would be okay with somebody calling him B tier, I think, but I think he's too niche for me. So I'm going to drop him down to the C tier. All right, now we come to the Halloween fusion, and that is Timit the Fool. Now, Timit has an interesting kit. I did, in fact, complete this fusion. If you got Kaya, his duo, he's even better. There's definitely an improvement if you have those 2 champions. I did not get her. So here we have pretty good base stats and an interesting kit. He heals himself on his A1, and this is a lot of healing. So it attacks twice, and each hit heals this champion by 10% of their max HP. So that means he gets 20% max HP heal. If the target has no active buffs, each hit also fills this champion's turn meter by 10%. So he also gets turn meter on this potentially. That's a lot of healing, and anybody who has that much healing can be a potential solo champion. In addition, you can see that this skill gets booked into additional healing. So with 20% additional healing, he could get healed by 24% of his max HP on every A1. That's a lot. That's a ton for somebody who has that big an HP pool. Now, his A2 is really interesting. It is an AoE that decreases the duration of all enemy buffs by 3 turns. The nice thing is that doesn't count as a buff strip, so this won't proc sheep debuffs. Like you won't get sheeped in the arena if you use this skill. Again, it's even stronger with Kaya the Rai. The A3 is another AoE. Before attacking, places an increased accuracy buff on all allies for 2 turns and places a True Fear debuff on all enemies for 1 turn. The increased accuracy buff, as I mentioned, I think that's stronger than a decreased resistance debuff. I really like the increased accuracy buff, which makes him viable for things like high-end Doom Tower and Hydra. And finally, he gets additional turn meter fill based on his passive. He does have accuracy in all battles aura, so you can see that he's adding accuracy to the team, which can be useful in a lot of places. So he definitely has a good niche, but I think unlike the other 2 niche champions that we were talking about this year, Timit is a better progression champion. All of the AoEs, all of the self-sustain, you can find a lot of uses for this guy. And my guess is at endgame, you're going to be given some choices. You're going to be able to specialize him in different places. Potentially, you can make him a very versatile champ. I do think that if you have Kaya the Rai, he's very good. But without her, I think he probably sits somewhere in the B tier. Strong in progression, relatively versatile, has some endgame use, a little bit underwhelming on his own. With Kaya, I think he jumps up into the A tier. And I think the duo probably borderline S tier, right? Probably A+ tier if you have them together. I wouldn't be too upset if somebody pushed this guy higher. I haven't used mine all that much, and so I don't know exactly how strong he is in all of those places. But at least in terms of progression, I've heard from the community, he's pretty strong in progression, and he can do a lot of different things early in the game. So if you got this guy, I think if he was your first fusion, you're pretty happy with that first fusion. Okay, the last two fusions of the year were both in the Ogryn Tribes faction, and the first one here is Ugir, the Worm Eater. Now, if you look at the base stats are really solid, but this is an interesting kit. The A1 has a 100% chance of stealing a random buff from the enemy and placing a block buff debuff on the enemy for 2 turns. That actually strikes me as an incredibly useful A1, and I think it wasn't talked about that much when he came out, but I'm looking forward to build. I do have mine. I'm looking forward to building mine and getting some use out of this A1. The A2 is an AoE that has a 100% chance of removing all buffs from all enemies and has a 100% chance of placing weaken on all enemies. So a very good A2. The A3 is increased accuracy. You already know I like that. Plus an increased defense on all allies whose defense is higher than their attack, and an increased attack buff on all allies whose attack is higher than their defense. I don't love this, but it allows you some flexibility with your team composition, and additional buffs are always good. And then finally, we have this passive, which is really the unique aspect of his kit. Whenever an enemy is revived, instantly activates Earth Puncture. That's the A2, which is the AoE that can remove all buffs and land the weaken. Now, the really big thing about this is if it's an enemy that is revived by a champion from the Lizardman faction, basically Pythion, who was the January fusion, the effects of Earth Puncture cannot be resisted. So it doesn't require accuracy if you're going up against Pythion. So he's basically a great Pythion counter. Another aspect of this is that instantly activating Earth Puncture will not place the skill on cooldown. So even though this passive has a 1-turn cooldown, the Earth Puncture does not get the cooldown when it's activated. Now there is a buff coming to Ugir the Worm Eater, which is he will be activating his passive. He does not currently activate his passive, but he will be activating his passive when Wukong revives. I'm pretty sure that will work for all revive on death skills. So this champion is actually going to get a lot stronger, and he can be incredibly powerful in arena. He's already very good. This 100% chance of removing all buffs is fantastic. The fact that it can't be resisted against Lizardman revivers is fantastic. So you're going to see him a lot in live arena. I think he's also very good in faction crypts. He's very good in Doom Tower. Anytime you need a 100% buff strip champion or a weaken, I think this guy is going to be fantastic. He does his damage based on HP, and he hits decently hard as well. Now, despite the fact that I do have my Ugir and he is 6 stars, I haven't yet had the time to build him out and test him myself. So I don't know how good he is going to be, but he does feel like he's fairly versatile. He would be a very good progression champion. And as a free-to-play player, I think this is the perfect kind of fusion to go for if he's your first fusion. Late in the game, at endgame, I'm not exactly sure how valuable he's going to be, but I do think, at least for live arena, he's got a lot of value. So that's a place where now, with the extra chances to get primal quartz and obviously the desire to farm the metals for area bonuses, I think he's got a lot of value just there in live arena, even if you're not using him in a lot of other places. Although I think also in 3v3 arena and classic arena, you're going to find some use for him. So when I was thinking about where to categorize Ugir, I was struggling. I'm not really sure. He's definitely at least as good as Oella and Supreme Elhain. I think he's probably as usable as Razzlevarg. I'm not sure how he compares to Islan, because again, I'm a little bit unsure of Islan and I'm a little bit unsure of Ugir. They do feel like potential S tier champions. And so I think I'm going to put him right up here next to Islan. I think he's going to live in between S tier and A tier. Once he gets that buff that's supposed to happen at the beginning of the year, where he's going to proc his passive based on Wukong's revive on death skill, I think he's going to be a great counter for Wukong, and people are going to find more and more usage for this guy. So if you happen to fuse him, I think you're really going to be happy that you did in a couple of months' time. So he may even creep up into the S tier in the future. So right now, I'm going to put him at the A+ or S- tier. I feel pretty comfortable there. He might move up, he might move down, but I think that that's a reasonable placement for him right now. Okay, now we come to our last champion, Blizzar. the Howler. I just collected mine last night. I'm very excited. I think this guy is a fantastic champion. I do think originally we were all a little bit less enthusiastic about this champion than we should have been. As players have gotten him and started to experiment with him, they're finding more and more ways to use him. Now, I already thought he was going to be good. I think he's a great progression champion. He has potential to freeze 3 champions on his A1. He's got an interesting ally protect and increased defense on his A2, so he could be usable in Clan Boss or Hydra for this skill alone. His A3 is a 100% AoE freeze that also decreases turn meter of all enemies by 30%. That's fantastic. And then he's immune to freezes himself and will actually return those freezes to the... And then he is actually immune to freezes himself, and he will return those freezes back to sender. He also has this second passive, which is a little bit like Wukong, which whenever he's killed, he revives himself with 30% HP and 30% turn meter, and then places a revive on death buff on himself for 1 turn. So you actually have to kill this champion 3 times before he's dead. I think as a progression champion, an AoE hard CC is hard to overlook. It's just extremely strong. Also, the triple hitter on his A1. So he's going to be useful right away in the early game. Through the mid game, he's going to help you in wave content. He's not going to speed up your runs that much, but he's going to increase your success chances in Doom Tower and in the dungeons. And then when you get into hard Fire Knight, he's going to be huge. There's also a new build that's going around with him where he can solo Sand Devil 25, which is pretty outstanding. You do need a 5-star blessing on him, I believe. But again, at endgame, he's going to have a ton of uses. He's a great progression champion. He's very versatile. So I think this guy is an outstanding champion, and I think his stock is just going to continue to rise. So when I first assessed him, I probably would have put him in the A tier, but I'm starting to think that he is an S tier champion. I actually think that he is less niche than Islin and Ugir, who I don't think are necessarily niche. I do think they're fairly versatile champions, but they are sort of specialists. I do think that Blizzard is going to end up being everywhere, especially early on in the game. If you pulled them, you're going to use them in all content. I don't think there's really any content where you're going to find that you can't use this guy. So I think he's just more versatile than most of the champions on this list. And he's got a kit that's highly usable at endgame, more so than some of the other champions on this list. So that is it. Looking back at the fusions of 2023, I think we actually did pretty well. I do think that Newt is one of the top 2 or 3 fusions of all time. I think Emic may land in the top 5 before all is said and done. And we got 2 clear S tier champions in Blizzard and Pythion, plus a bunch of good A tier champions that are highly usable and valuable for all accounts. We did get some B tier and C tier champions, but even the C tier champions have some niches that could be valuable to the right players. So don't feel like just because they're down at C tier, they have no uses. I do think they have uses, and they could potentially provide a lot of value to the right player and the right roster at the right time. I have several of the champions on this list that I still need to build out. I am looking forward to getting my Blizzard up and running, to getting my Ugir going at full speed, and to start messing around with my Islin and see what he can do. In addition, I'll probably build my Supreme Elhaina at some point. I have 2 copies of her, so I might even empower her, just get a little bit of extra out there. We'll have to see. But those 3 champions at the top of the list, Newt, Emic, and Pythion, those are already all over my account, making progress everywhere I look. They've become 3 cornerstones of my endgame account, and I absolutely love those champions. Okay, that is it for this list. Let me know in the comments below if you agree or disagree with any of my ratings for these champions. Absolutely let me know, especially for the B and C tier champions here, if you've envisioned uses that I've missed. Maybe you know something that I don't because you actually have built out these champions and you are using them, and maybe I didn't give them a fair shake. That can happen. All right, thanks so much for hanging out. I've been Colred, and I will see you in another video soon.